us off, Shuchi and Regina, for both of you for organizing this. Could someone confirm you can see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So let's get going. So a little bit of background on me, as mentioned by Shuchi. I used to work at SAP and I work at Stripe. So in both instances, it's really about providing tooling to entrepreneurs to grow businesses. So at SAP, I was in the quote to cash domain, solutions like subscription billing. And Stripe, as some of you may know, grew out of the payments industry and is all around really trying to focus on helping entrepreneurs and startups to grow their businesses, and through that to grow overall the GDP of the internet. That's what we see as our mission, and we take it quite seriously because there's a lot to be done, and we're in the very early days of building value online. So let's talk about pricing. So if you're starting a new business, if you've got a new startup idea, then I want to start by talking about when should one think about pricing and what are the various phases that we should go through. And the first thing to say, I think, is if you're really at the very beginning of an entrepreneurial journey, don't think too much about pricing at all. In fact, wait a while. So it's much more important to think about your product and the value it can deliver for your target customers. And then after that, you will naturally come to ideas of what your business model might look like. And we'll talk through some ideas of how you can structure a business model. But it's more important to just think about value and just think about what you're delivering to your customers and to iterate and to get to your first ideas of what your product market fit is going to be for your idea. And out of that, naturally will fall this idea of, well, okay, that means my business model is probably going to be more like this or more like that. And the things or the levers you can pull in terms of what you can monetize. Once you get that, you're then looking at your first customers and your first customers that you're looking to onboard, to serve. And then you want to look at how I might be pricing and packaging. Now, throughout most of the conversation that I'll be walking through today, I'll be focusing more on B2B, right? So my expertise personally is more on B2B. So this is more going to be an enterprise or SaaS style pricing is what we're talking about today. So I have some ideas of B2C because I've seen some companies that have gone through iterations of business models there as well. But bear in mind, most of what I'm talking about today here is in the business-to-business world. So the second step then here that you can see represented in the middle is you're working with your first customers, you're iterating on your pricing, you're getting good signals and feedback from those customers. You're tuning your price points, you're tuning the things that you're actually pricing and how it's all packaged together. And then you're ready to, set on some of what your initial price points will be. And then it's a continuous process where you're iterating and scaling from there. One important thing to realize is that one of the easiest levers to move in a young and growing business is the pricing lever. Adding features is hard. Adding distribution channels is hard. Hiring people is hard. But changing a price point, moving it up or down, and then through that getting more or better qualified customers or users of whatever you're building, your solution, your product, it's actually one of the easiest levers to turn. So don't hesitate to turn it early and often. And generally what I would recommend is that in the beginning life cycle of a company, at least every quarter, go back and just think about monetization, think about pricing, review the signals you're getting from your customers, think about whether you want to make a change, whether you want to move something in a different direction, or how your customers or how the general market might react. In a later stage of the company, you might only do that every 6 months. I think in any company, you at least need to be doing it once a year, or revisiting your pricing. So change the timing a little bit over time, start quarterly and then maybe move to yearly as you go. So one of the fundamental questions is, what are you monetizing? And so generally that'll be fairly natural for you to know. There are some well-worn patterns out there. So here are some examples. Salesforce, they're mostly selling their own applications, but they have some services like professional services or training that they also monetize separately. They're also very well known for the platform, so Force.com or everything they've built there. And they also have the App Exchange, which also brings a revenue share component or a platform-based monetization component as well. That's also very important to Salesforce and to their broader ecosystem and making all of that work. Facebook, pure B2C, it's quote unquote free because advertisers are paying for everything. So that's another alternative model. Red Hat is a good example of you don't actually, in the classic Linux open source type model, you're not charging for the open source solution itself, because that's anathema in that world, but you are charging professional services and training and a bunch of additional services you can add on around. And then Amazon, they are primarily charging Amazon Web Services rather for their core platform, the infrastructure, the platform as a service, but they're also charging a little bit for application distribution through there with some revenue share models. And then of course you can also get a little bit of services and some paid training from Amazon as well. So this is a classic set of different monetization models. You could add on different columns here and look at what different companies are doing. But one of the first things that will naturally fall out of the type of product you're building and who you're addressing as a buying audience or as a buying customer will start to fall into these various areas. So these gives you then the things that you need to think about, what you need to price. And as we're going through, don't hesitate to ask questions. If you want to interrupt me, then please do so. And I will also be monitoring the chat. So if you want to just put a question in there, that works fine too. So hearing no questions, I'll move on. One of the most important things, I think, so if you take away one thing from this presentation, the thing that I've seen as being most useful to myself when I was trying to set pricing models for solutions I was responsible for as a product manager and setting pricing for, is to really keep bringing the conversation back to what is the value that you're driving for your customers. And so value as expressed in an actual numerical amount, right? You want to try and get some analysis, even though it may be a guesstimate, of how you're actually deriving tangible value that you can put a price on for your customers, that you can plug into a return on investment calculation, ideally. And so you start that by speaking to your initial customers that are, when you're very, very early stage and you're looking at product market fit, then speak to the customers. How do they see this translating into value for them? What are you replacing or displacing? Is there some custom process that you're replacing? Is it a bunch of people that are being thrown at the problem, and how much do they cost internally? So what are some of the value drivers that is going to tell you how much your solution is worth to your customer? So don't just make it anecdotal. Again, try and actually build a model, put it in a spreadsheet, right? Start playing around with the numbers, and then figure out what are some of the common KPIs that you're seeing, the common metrics you're seeing across your different customer cases, where people are thinking about this maybe in different ways. And over time, you'll find that these tend to coalesce around probably a relatively small number of KPIs that are driving most of the value you're delivering to your customers. And then tie that back to what your software is actually doing, right? So how is your software tied into this, or what you're building, your solution, let's say software, but whatever product that you're building, what are some of the main drivers you have on that side? And we'll talk a little bit later about your cost model for the product or service that you're building, which you also need to understand and know, so you can ultimately get to margin per customer. But drive also your internal metrics, your cost to serve for a large customer versus a small, for a big deployment versus a small deployment. Get some idea of that as well. And once you're armed with that data, then number one, you can use it to structure your sales conversation with your customers, be they self-serve, arriving on a website and signing up, or if you actually have a sales force going out, you can start to have a conversation around value rather than just a conversation around price. And that's really, really key. So the companies who are smart are the ones who always have the conversation on value and not the conversation on price or cost to the customer. And then the other great advantage of having this data and having this model is that you can have the value conversation with your customer, and the customers that you win, you can go back to them over time. So as they go live on your solution, as they start using it in reality, you can check in with them on a regular basis and figure out, okay, we thought that you're going to derive value, worth this amount of money to you over this amount of time. Did that happen? Check it with them, right? Get them to tell you and feedback to you, okay, well, we thought we were going to get an uplift of this or cost savings of Y. In reality, we got something was better or slightly under or over or whatever it was. Gather that data and go back and refine your model. And that then makes that when you're going to do your next sale, you're having this set of benchmarks you can talk about, and you can talk to your customers about, well, over time, you'll have so many customers, you'll be able to say, okay, this is a new prospect. They're in, Western Europe. they're in the retail industry. They got this type of a use case. I've already sold, 3 similar customers, and they derived this in terms of value. And now again, you have a more precise value conversation back with that new prospect that you're talking to, right? So just iterate through that loop and gather all that data. And so that's really good to have the value conversation. And it's also good actually when you need to make changes to your pricing model. Get a question here from Sri on the example of Salesforce pricing in different areas. A lot of that is public actually, so you can actually explore Salesforce pricing on their website. And so classically, a lot of their main monetization models is selling something like Commerce Cloud or Sales Cloud or Marketing Cloud, what have you, based upon a set of metrics that they've chosen that's germane to that area. So for example, Sales Cloud is sold in a per user per month model, and I'll talk about how those are structured and thought about in a little while. So that piece you get some idea oftentimes of list pricing for many of those solutions. And then they layer on top of that pricing for things like professional services or expert services or whatever terms that they may use. The platform piece and the application distribution, that's a little bit harder sometimes to learn publicly what they're doing, but you can speak to people in the industry, and there's various ways that people who are plugging into the ecosystem of Salesforce, when they make a sale that's sort of generated off Salesforce and the App Exchange, bringing that customer to the startup or the partner of Salesforce, then there's actually a way in which there's a little bit of a revenue share going on there from the application partner back to Salesforce. So that's the way in which some of those are structured. So back to what I talked about, but gathering data on your customers, and the more you gather, the more you'll be able to plug into something that looks a little bit like this. Where you have this, big, spreadsheet where you built your model. And so you're able to go through your various customer cases. Now, these can be customers that you have won or lost. So again, try and gather information from customers that you haven't actually won them as a customer also, but you can still potentially gather some data. And also prospects. So say, okay, maybe I'm too small right now to go after this big prospect I'd love to get in the future, but let's imagine what that prospect would look like. Let's imagine how much they'll be using and how much they'll be buying of my solution, and also maybe what value they might get from it, and just plug those numbers into your formula, into your spreadsheet. And so by adding up the value that you're getting for the various KPIs, let's say you do it on an annualized basis, you'll get to some value that tells you how much are these customers getting from your solution. You can then run your pricing model for those customers. So based upon the metrics you've chosen and the pricing model, you can run through a little bit of math, essentially running through your pricing model and simulating it just in a simple spreadsheet that tell you that this customer with this size or this number of users or deployments or whatever the scaling factor is, they're going to end up paying you some amount of money. And then you net one against the other. So the total value versus the price, and you get to essentially the customer net value or their ROI, if you will, if they would choose your solution. Similarly, if you're also modeling what's your cost to serve, so what do you need to deploy to make this customer successful? That's your own internal costs, maybe running some software in AWS, whatever it might be. You have a model of your costs that you then put against your pricing model, and it gives you your net margin, if you will, per deal. And so using that, you can start to see where some of the sweet spots might be. So where the customers where your value is relatively high, maybe compare the customer value against price or your margin against the cost to serve the customer. You start to get a good feel of how your pricing model, this given pricing model, maybe your current pricing model, how it's behaving across these different customer segments. And then also what's great is when you want to maybe change your pricing model, you want to say, well, okay, how about if I change my price up or down, or change the structure of my pricing? Then when you can go back to this data that you've gathered and put in some new columns, and you see, okay, under the new pricing model, what happens, right? How does this customer net value change? Because I've changed the pricing, so the customer net value will change. And how does my margin change? Because again, I've changed pricing, it's going to affect my margin. And then you're going to see that there might be quote unquote winners and losers. Some customers are going to maybe start paying slightly more. Some will start paying slightly less under this new model. Your margin might be more, your margin might be less. And then you can sort of think through in your mind about, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it ultimately going to get me to have more deals won? Or is it a bad change because most customers are going to see raise prices or lower ROI on the solution? So again, the more data you gather as you go through, when you're going in your regular checkpoints and how your monetization model is working, you can then refer back to it and constantly build this database of data that you can use to tune and refine your pricing model as you go. Okay. So the iteration process is very important. And now let's move to talking about maybe how you might structure some of your pricing. One of the first items to know is that it's very different if you're going in to an established market and you're going to be a new cut on an old concept, let's say, or you're moving into a market that's already populated by a bunch of different solutions and you're adding a new one, but which is like much better because you got some secret sauce in there. Then that market is already established in some way. So they're going to already think about this solution in a particular way. They have an idea of what your product does. They've already probably an idea in their mind of how much value it is because your competitors have already established that in the market before you got there. And that's very different than category creation, where you've got something that's really brand new, that doesn't really fit in an existing model, where your buying audience, it's the first time they've seen it or the first time they've seen something really quite like it. There you have the ability to do the pure value-based play and establish the price directly related to the value. In the case where it's the existing market, you have to realize you have competitors, and those competitors have price points, and they have price packaging, and they have price metrics that they have chosen. And your buying audience will be used to working with the competitors in that way. It's going to be a little bit more difficult for you to break out of that and do something radically different. So you may need to work within that structure. You can still think about value. You can still have your price be correlated to value, but you get a little bit more constraints because you're working in the competitive situation, which is the normal default case, actually. The third point in here, when in doubt, set list pricing high. If you have any doubt about your pricing, start high. Don't start low. When you're going in as a new entrepreneur, as a new startup into the space, you're not going in because you think you can sell something cheaply. And generally, you're going in because you think you get something that's 10 times better than what's there before. You got something that's really special. So if you have something that's really, really special, you should be able to command a price premium. Maybe not directly, immediately today, but over time, as you make it better and better, you can definitely aim for that higher price point. So, set your price for where you want to be over some time in the market. Give yourself a premium feel if you think you deserve a premium feel. So aim high. The market will tell you if you're too expensive. Through your sales, through your self-service on the website, the commerce channel, whatever, you will see where people are, stopping at the time of signing the deal because of pricing, or they will tell you that directly. So you can always come down on price, and coming down on price is a much easier thing to do than going up on price. So once you've established an idea for price point in the market, that attaches in some sense to your brand. And everyone's always very happy if you reduce that price over time, but increasing it is very, very difficult to do. So again, when in doubt, start high, and then let the market maybe bring you down to what level you should really be at. One point just to mention is that when you're selling internationally, and so maybe you're starting and you're only concentrating on one market. If you're in the US, maybe you're starting in the US. If you're in Europe, you're maybe just starting in 1 or 2 countries in Europe. But over time, you are going to go internationally. And so companies who are already international, they already have an idea of what their price books look like for different countries. And they will change the pricing metrics, and that's or change the price points rather. And that's because you have to realize that discounting behaviors and expected discounting, particularly in the B2B sense, is very different in different countries. So Latin America expects high discounts compared to the US. Similarly, for a lot of countries in, let's say, Southeast Asia compared to the US. And so you ultimately want everyone to be paying the same fair price, but how you get to the fair price through discounting is quite different in the different countries. So you need to reflect that back into your model sometimes. And there's also then foreign exchange risks. So if you're in a very stable currency versus an unstable currency, then you probably want to hedge a little bit and increase the price just to protect yourself against some foreign currency fluctuations. If your local customers are paying in a currency that's fluctuating a lot, then you probably want to build in a little bit of buffer there. So when you convert that back to your, let's say, home currency, then you're okay, and you're not going to find yourself upside down. So let's talk a little bit about pricing metrics. So back to the conversation on value, when you're thinking about what are you charging for, and what is the thing that you're going to scale. So in the Salesforce case, for Sales Cloud, it's number of users. So number of seats, number of salespeople, sales ops people, whatever. That's their core metric. So it's a users metric. You can have lots of different metrics, and you'll see if you look at the websites of different companies, particularly those that are sharing their pricing, you'll see that the metric can be very different. It can be number of drawings generated for some a document design company. It can be a number of houses built for someone that's looking to have a new solution for architecting and planning for houses. So the metrics can be very, very different, but you need to choose your metrics. And ideally, you want that metric to be correlated more or less to the value you think you're deriving for your customers. So choose a metric that you think will track well to the value. So again, you've done your studies on what is the value you're generating for your customers. Now think back to what's some simple metrics that you'll get you there. So you don't want like 6, 20 metrics. Ideally, you want one. Maybe you can have 2 or 3, but you don't want too many, because the more that you have, the more you're confusing customers. So remember that the customer has to know in their head what the metric means to them, so that they can figure out what your pricing model will mean to them. And so ideally, just one metric that you're going to be scaling on, that you'll be charging different price points on the metric. So the customers have to be able to understand them and know how they're going to scale. You also want it, in an ideal case, to roughly correlate to your cost to provide the service. So that same metric of, go back to users for Salesforce and Sales Cloud, the more seats that there are, the more users that they're selling, roughly correlates to how much traffic is coming into the tenant that they're selling for an individual customer for Salesforce. So there's a rough correlation, not perfect, but a rough correlation between that same metric, number of users, and their costs to actually serve their customers. That's good, right? So you want those two to be correlated. It's never perfect. It's never a perfect world. As mentioned a little bit earlier, and you're building this big spreadsheet of all your customers, it's not an exact science. You're trying to do a best fit, really. So again, your metrics are going to be best fit. They're going to work probably for 80, 90% of your customers. You're doing really, really well. There's always going to be some customers that will say, this metric doesn't work for me, right? I work in a different way. I'm a special animal. Your metric, your structure just won't work. And that's fine. You're always going to have some that'll fall off the end. You can never get to perfection. And then you can maybe do some special deal or some special deal structure for those customers, but find the one that works for 80, 90% of your customers. As mentioned, you may need to align with your competitors. If there's already a well-established notion that this is the metric, everyone uses that metric, then that's what the basis of comparison is going to be when a customer is comparing you to your competitors. They're going to compare on price against this metric. So normally you're going to have to fall in line, and that's what's going to make your deal cycles easier, because they're going to be able to tell you what that metric is and how that metric is going to change over time, so you can build your pricing proposal. But sometimes you can decide, actually, no, my solution is so different and solves this problem in such a different way that this metric is not actually relevant for me, or this is like a legacy metric that I want to tarnish my competitors with a legacy term by saying they're all using this old metric. I think we can do a much better job, but I'm going to actually price based on this different metric, and then show how that demonstrates and correlates to a new type of value you're delivering for this maybe same solution category to the same set of customers. So you can disrupt with a metric. It's dangerous. It's not often done. It does lead to friction in customer conversations, but model it out and maybe the payoff can be pretty good. One last thing I'll say, and this is for those of you that are in engineering, is that you need to be able to measure these metrics within the context of your software if you're building a software solution, because you need to be able to know directly and measure these metrics so that you can give, let's say, the entitlement to your customers that they deserve. So back to the seats example, if someone's buying a particular number of users or seats for the solution, then you need to be able to at least trigger a warning when they're starting to get close to that number of users or seats. So you need to be able to measure that metric internally. And then when they're getting close to it, then it becomes an opportunity to do an upsell. So they need to buy more seats, they need to buy more users, they need to buy more of your metric. So you need to be able to measure it within the context of your software. It can be hazardous to choose a metric that only your customer knows and that you can't actually measure directly yourself, because then you're reliant on your customer to be telling you what that metric is, so that you know when you may need to charge a little bit more once they go over their limit, let's say. Okay, that's on metrics. On pricing and packaging, so a very classic way of packaging for a lot of SaaS business, again, to make this very specific to SaaS pricing, is in this editions approach. And so typically you will see this very common method of having these 3 packages. It's good to have not too many. If you can only have 1, that's great, but it doesn't give you a lot of differentiation. So frequently people will come up with 3. So here it's termed individual teams and enterprise. You want the names of your packages to mean something to your buying audience, so they can, self-select. Don't make them too generic. If you can have like the name of a function or a type, like maybe hobbyist versus, semi-professional versus professional, whatever will correlate with the buying audience that you're primarily targeting. And then within each of those editions, you're having these different features that are slotted in. So everyone in all editions gets feature A, also get feature B, but you have to go to the Teams edition to get feature C. And if you want D and E, you have to buy the Enterprise edition in this particular example. So it's a good way of differentiating between your different customer types, your different audiences. And it allows you to charge, ideally substantially different amounts for the different packaging of features. So a good way to, segment your customer base on some, big, large buying audiences and segments, and then charge a lot to those who are willing to pay a lot and are deriving a lot of value from certain sets of features you may be providing, while still providing an easier entry package, sometimes in a land and expand strategy with a much, much smaller packaging for the individual, as is marked here. So classic way to do it. It does mean that every time you're thinking about a new feature, so maybe you're already selling in this way with these 3 different packages, and now you get a new feature concept that a customer has talked to you about, and you've been prototyping and you want to add it in. You then, with that new feature, you get to choose, where do I put it? Does every customer get this? Is it only go into Teams and Enterprise, or does it only go into Enterprise? So you can then choose where to slot features, and you just should think about where you're going to be slotting it early on as you're starting to think about and prototype and build a business case for that particular feature. It also means that, again, for the engineering teams, you need to make sure that that's in your software. You need to be able to turn features on and off, because you may change this over time. You may actually start doing a little bit of repackaging and moving features around. It's a big change if you do that, but maybe it's something you want to do. And so every feature has to have feature flags and feature gates, so you can choose from a monetization perspective how you actually want to package it ultimately when it comes to market. So on top of then these basic packages that we created, so the individual, the small business, and the enterprise in this example, you can have other things that are layered on top. Now, again, if you can avoid it, don't do this. Simple is always better. But sometimes you may have a complex sale, particularly if you're selling a solution that is maybe more technical and selling maybe to a technical audience. Then you can sometimes have add-ons that you might need to add, and these might be purely technical add-ons. So in this example, again, it's a enterprise SaaS example. In each individual package that I sell, I got the users and the feature bundles that we talked about earlier, but also I'm getting production and test tenants, so 1 production and 2 test tenants every time, and a certain amount of, let's say, storage. Maybe storage is something that's very germane for this solution that I'm selling. And then some customers will say, okay, that's great, but I'm big complex enterprise. I need more than 1 production and 2 test tenants. I'd like to have another additional test tenant for to play around with as well. So you maybe want to have a separate fee for that. And that's the same flat fee maybe across all of your customers, independent of which individual small business or enterprise that they bought. Same thing maybe for storage would be a similar model. And that sometimes you can also choose to have entirely separate feature packs that are priced separately, that are not included in any of the additional individual small business or enterprise, because you may have something where, well, each of these customer types, each of these individual segments might need this thing, and it could be a good upsell opportunity, but I don't want to give it away to everyone as part of the base offer. And I don't want to force an individual to upgrade to small business in order to get this feature either. So maybe I just add it as an entirely separate add-on that can be added on to any of the base packages that I've created. Again, do that if you really need to, because again, you're making your pricing models more complex. More complex means that it's harder to quote if you have a sales team. It's harder to understand on your website for self-serve customers coming to you. And it's harder for customers just to make a decision on, to pull the trigger on. So again, keep it simple if you can, but you do have this ability to add on these horizontal feature add-ons as well. And then lastly, you do have, particularly now we're back into B2B enterprise and typically large enterprise deals, you can have things like multi-year discounts, and you can have an automatic logic there that tells you that if a customer signs up, rather than just being a contract at will, let's say, and a pure usage-based, maybe they're saying, I'm going to give you signing up for 1 year, even 3 years or 5 years contracts that we've seen as well. And that unlocks extra discounts because they're guaranteeing that, unless there's like some force majeure, they're going to continue to be a customer of yours for those number of years. You can also have ramp plans. So rather than buying up to, a certain number of licenses here in this user per month model, rather than saying, I'm going to buy 100 users for you, you're going to say, I'm going to sign a 3-year contract. But in the first year, I expect to only need, 10 users. Next year, 50, and then the following year, 100. So you can sort of plot into the contract, and this is common again in enterprise SaaS, these ramp plans where you're actually ramping volume over time. It becomes a point of the negotiation. So they're ultimately going to get to 100 users. They're only starting with 10. So that maybe changes the discounting that you give to them compared to someone who would start with 100 and maintain it 100 flat all the way through, right? It can be something that can be negotiated. And you can also build into your pricing model an annual uplift maybe throughout that contract term. Or you might build in that there might be an automatic, a renewal uplift. So if the customer renews after the contract term, you expect that prices will rise by 5% or 7% or whatever it might be, to account for inflation and to account for the fact that you're expecting maybe that over that time you're adding more features and you think you're maybe becoming more valuable. So maybe you want to set the expectation with the customer that when you come to renew your contract, some years down the road, we're expecting that in the default case, you're going to pay us a little bit more. Now, it can always be negotiated. The customer can always walk away at the end of that contract term. But you want to set the expectation that you think your list prices are going to be rising at that time. And that's the context that the new negotiation will happen in. So pricing tiers. So we got your pricing and packaging. We have our metrics that we've defined. And now we need to deal with volume, right? So how many, in our SaaS example, how many users are people buying? How many units are they buying? How many gigabytes? How many documents does this company expect to use over time? So the simple way is to say, well, it's just, $10 per user per month. And it's always that, independent of how many users that you're buying. That generally is not a great model to have in large enterprise deals, or even in many like medium-sized enterprise deals, because their expectation is set that the more they buy, the more there's a guaranteed volume discount. And so the best way to manage that, rather than having to discount and have that conversation with a sales team every deal cycle to figure out what discount you're going to give, is to build discounting into your basic pricing model. So essentially an inbuilt volume discount already in your list price. So that's all a tiering model is. It's as simple as that. It's just building in that more you buy, the cheaper it is per unit. So again, for those of you that are looking at enterprise SaaS, typically you just need to do 3 to 5 tiers. 3 is most stuff, I think, what I've seen. And 3 essentially gives you 2 inflection points on that curve. So you're pricing for a first part, a second part, and a third part, and you can set how far apart they are from a volume perspective. You can sometimes have more tiers if you need to model a slightly different S-shaped curve, let's say, where you think your very, very high-end customers want a really, really low price per unit. You can do that as well. Just play around with the number of tiering points that you need in your model. And again, typically in enterprise SaaS, we see a difference in the actual price level between your lowest tier and your highest tier with a ratio of about 1 to 5. And again, the more you buy, the cheaper it is per unit. But I have seen some as well where there's a difference of like 1 to 40 or 1 to 50 even in the enterprise SaaS space. So there is a broad range, but most enterprise SaaS companies, at least in that particular discipline, tend to do it around a 1 to 5 range between the bottom and top of your tiering structure. I'll leave this in the deck as sort of a leave behind. There are different ways of actually structuring tiering that give you different shapes of the curve, if you will, from a simple block pricing to a volume pricing, which is really where we're talking about tiering here. The price per unit is going down over time. And there's a different way of structuring that with a price per unit that changes depending on total volume, which then gives you these little step changes, which can be annoying sometimes to work with, and particularly as you're going through upgrade cycles or upsells with their customers, those can be annoying. So sometimes people will use this model over here on the right called a tier pricing, where you're actually pricing individually for each additional piece of the curve. A little bit complex, but once we share these slides, you can take a look at it, and it's pretty easy to figure out if you just spend 2 minutes on it. So that's on tiered pricing. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about usage and consumption pricing. We're seeing that a lot at Stripe, where I work. That's what we use. And the advantage of that is that number one, customers are only paying what they really use. It also means that they can start immediately. And so your barrier to entry can be very, very low. You don't necessarily need a sales conversation. If someone is starting and playing around with your solution, just let them have at it. As they're starting to use, then they need to start paying you. And so it's a very easy onboarding ramp when you start with a pure usage-based model. It's also customer-centric in the sense that there's sort of the guarantee that the customer is only paying for what they're really using. One of the disadvantages of the classic enterprise SaaS model, where people are buying big blocks of seats, is they're committed to paying this amount of money, whether they actually use those number of seats or not. And so that's one of the drawbacks of that classical enterprise SaaS model, and it's a little bit being challenged right now by usage-based models. A lot of people are running towards usage-based models or asking their vendors to step into those models as well. Some of the disadvantages are that some customers are just very used to the regularity and planning of a very fixed cost model, where I need this much of your software. I'm going to budget this over the next year or 2 years, and I know I'm going to be paying this, and it's not going to go up and down. And I just like the security of that from a budgeting perspective. Whereas a usage-based model, who knows how much I'm going to use? It may burst and go up and down over time. Some companies like that, some companies don't. And also another disadvantage of a pure usage-based model, that's important to know for how you're running your company internally, is it does affect what you need to build internally. How if you're having a sales team, dedicated sales team that are paid on commission, then they need to be paid based on usage, maybe, or an adoption of the solution, or maybe on a predicted usage of the solution over time. And that can be challenging because regular sales compensation tools may really deal with that very well. They tend to think of the deal is signed, deals for this amount of money, which is sort of guaranteed that's going to come from the customer, and I commission my salespeople off that. When the customer is signing up and they're going to pay in a usage model, you don't really know. You can maybe predict, but you don't really know how much they might be paying over time, or it's harder to know. So therefore, how do you compensate your salespeople and have them work harder for the big deals? It also means that when you're billing your customers on usage, you need to have a billing system that can do that. So your quote to cash chain and how you're billing your customers can be a little bit more complex. But this is becoming more and more common. A lot of companies are adopting this, and I'd like to know if any of you are considering that as well. One of my last points here is really on modeling your cost as well. So pricing is good, making margin and making profit is better. And so this is just some tools to think about this. And so you can break down your cost structure into your costs to fulfill a customer contract. And that's everything from how much you're paying in infrastructure, your hardware and networking, or the people that are involved in running that. Maybe you're outsourcing that to Google Cloud or Amazon Cloud or whatever. So how much are they going to be charging you? You're brought back to the level of an individual customer for an individual choice of metric, maybe that the customer is scaling on. Your cost to operate the platform. Again, this is in the SaaS world, this is very important. Support as well. So typically, you may be bundling in some level of support to your contract, what your customer is paying on a monthly or an annual basis. And you may have a separate support offering, which is more like paid premium support, but you're probably offering some level of basic support. So how much does that cost you? The people that are dealing with the support tickets, that are answering the phone, that are helping the customer on a daily basis, how much are they costing? Again, brought back to the individual number of customers, so more like a per deal level of your support costs. Same for maintenance and what your engineering teams are doing, just in a break fix type work. And then third-party licenses you may be paying as well, because you're probably building something based upon stuff that already exists from other third parties. You then have your selling costs, which here is really just your sales commissions that you're expecting per deal. And then some idea of your basic margin. Now, in an early start, you may say, I don't care about margin, I just want to sell. And that's absolutely the right decision to make. But over time, you probably want to start building in some level of margin to what you have to cover your non-direct customer contract costs. So your general R&D for developing new stuff in the future, your G&A expenses, your sales and marketing expenses, those need to be covered as well. So you need to build in some basic margin. So all of this adds up to what your floor price is one of the terms that's used for your cost or your floor price. You have your list price that we talked about, which hopefully you're getting from calculating based upon value to your end customers. And then you've got the standard volume discount that's built in. So some of the tiering is already giving you some standard discounting there. So ultimately then you end up negotiating with your customers, particularly in a B2B, in a non-self-serve scenario. You have the space in which you can negotiate. And ultimately you always want to make sure that you're always selling above your floor price. Again, in the early days of a startup as an entrepreneur, don't worry too much about that. If you're selling underneath your cost basis, you're hoping that over time you're getting better about setting your price points and you're able to establish your value more clearly with your customers, that you're giving away less and less, and you're able to start raising the bar here, and so that your pricing is raising up closer to your net price over time. Later stage companies will actually then start compensating the salespeople differently. So the more they're close to the ideal target net price, the more they're getting accelerators in their commissions and bonuses if there are salespeople involved. The more that they're close or even under the floor price, the more they're going down from what their regular commission would be in a decelerator fashion. So that we're also seeing that sort of thing to happen. So really trying to make negotiations simpler for the salespeople, guiding them towards what the ideal price should be, and hopefully improving your margins over time. But you can't do that unless you've got a good idea of your costs. So this is not, a day one activity you need to do. Wait for a while. Wait until you see some customers, live and on your platform. Look at their behavior. Start looking at your costs, and then start building that in, from bottoms up on your pricing model. It'll start give you then, the difference with that in your list prices than what your per customer deal margin actually is. And my last point is just to talk about some revenue recognition gotchas. It's a small thing again in the early days, but we have seen some startups struggle with this a little bit. As you're growing, you will have to, figure out how you're recognizing revenue. And there's all sorts of rules about this. These things called ASC 606 and IFRS 15, just Google them. If you read the book, you will fall asleep very rapidly unless you're an accountant, in which case it's something that is a passionate subject. But it is a very complicated area, which is why we do need to pay for really good accountants and really good CFOs as your company grows, and auditors to interpret these rules. And different companies can have different interpretations of the rules. And I've even seen examples where in one instance, we were looking to acquire a company in a previous life of mine, and we actually valued different pieces of their revenue differently to how they did. And that was one of the reasons actually we decided not to actually do the deal, because they looked at their revenue and the revenue mix and how it was recognized over time differently than we did. It didn't actually fit with our general go-to-market model, so we had to say no. So be aware of that. Make sure that after you get to a certain stage in your company, and you're making tens of millions of revenues, let's say, then you need to get a revenue recognition expert in at least by that time to be able to figure that out. It can also, sometimes you can have VCs or investors might have the same worries if they see a little bit something strange about in the revenue recognition world. So that's it. I will also give you some resources that I found that would be useful, just people that are out there blogging or thinking or publishing on pricing and how to think about it and some of the options that you have. there is actually some really good stuff that's written out there. I'll note in particular many of the billing solution providers from Zuora, Chargeify, Stripe, of course, as well, tend to write in this stuff because those vendors tend to see these different models percolate through and they need to adapt their software to fit to these different pricing models. So it leads them to have some good insight about what people are actually playing around with and how they play around and how they ultimately settle on a good pricing model. There's a good, a little bit old now, 2017, but this is some good storytelling here from front about how they actually iterated and ultimately got to what their pricing model as well. So let me stop there and then pause for any last questions. I know I've taken a lot of your time, but if there's any questions, please free to unmute yourself or to put them in the chat.
Thank you, as always. A great presentation, Fergus. And
My pleasure.
right.